Deep dive interviews with music gear inventors, builders, creators, and tone chasers. The Gear Gab Podcast with Eric Dahl uncovers the behind-the-scenes stories of the music gear that inspires us. And now, here's your host, Eric Dahl.
It is my great pleasure to have the recent birthday boy on the Gear Gab Podcast. He is the founder of Gruhn Guitars. He is a writer. He is an author, vintage instrument expert and guru, and a regular at the Grand Ole Opry, Mr. George Gruhn. George, thanks for coming on the show.
I'm pleased to be on. Happy to be here.
And especially, with a spry 81 and still, doing such an incredible job. And in fact, over my shoulder is one of the Martin guitars where you worked with Martin, George. And then on the other side, you can see I've got the Versatar on the other side. But it's so much fun having you on, George. And we've certainly spent a lot of time together. I've known you since I was a teenager when my dad used to bring me to Nashville to your music store downtown. But I think the story of how, you got into vintage guitars and created, you kind of helped forge the path of where the vintage guitar market is today. And it was all while you were going to college, working on your degrees, right?
That is true. Well, my academic background is in zoology and animal behavior studies.
And you're in your office now at Gruhn Guitars, and you have a few of your friends around you.
I have 25 snakes in the office. And I don't know how many snakes I'll have a couple of months from now because I encourage sex in the office. And I know that my female Jamaican boa is pregnant now. I have 5 different species of Australian pythons, and here I have 6 different species of boas from around the world. And there's plenty of activity going on in the office.
Well, and you have more snakes and reptiles in your office than you had with guitars when you started Gruhn's.
Well, I started with one guitar, obviously, but I didn't own a guitar until my freshman year of college. I have a brother who's 3 years younger than me who started to play before I did, and he started out on a cheap harmony classical, but when he progressed enough that he was really wanting and needing a better guitar, my parents said that we had a budget of $300, and that was still in the 60s, so $300 could buy a pretty good guitar.
Oh yeah.
But he wasn't old enough yet to have a driver's license, and I had just gotten mine. So I drove him around, and he would play the guitars. I'd listen, and most of them just didn't appeal to me at all. And finally, we went to one store that had what they claimed was a new Martin, had a Martin tang tag on it, everything. It looked brand new, but he played it. It sounded good. And so we bought it, but I couldn't find it in any catalog.
Huh.
It didn't make much sense. I had friends who played guitar already, and I'd been collecting snakes since I was 8 years old. I was very familiar with the Linnaean taxonomic system that's used by botanists and zoologists. And in my mind, when I looked at my friends' guitars, they fit in a Linnaean taxonomic system just like reptiles.
See, and I thought that was so interesting. I read that, George, that you applied that way of study because, and obviously with the snake book for United States and Canada, but you applied that methodology to guitars, right?
It's the way I look at everything. It's always basic scientific method. Also forensics, because my father was a pathologist. I saw autopsies before I was 10 years old. Not everybody's daddy takes them to the morgue because it's educational, But I watched my father do autopsies, and it was educational, and it's a very definite methodology of looking at things and analysis. And I apply that to guitars, and I applied that even back then. And I knew that the guitar that my brother had was not in the Martin current catalog, because even though I didn't play a note on a guitar, I had friends who did, and I knew a lot of the basic models.
Right.
It just came very easily. But so I took a picture of the guitar. I mailed it to Martin. I included the serial number in the letter.
Mm-hmm.
And I got a return letter from Martin saying that it was a Martin dated 1929. It had gone back to the factory for reconditioning from that store.
Huh.
Martin refinished it and reconditioned it. It looked new, but it was made in 29. It was a single of 28 herringbone trim koa wood guitar. And it sounded good. And that was the first one that he played. My brother played. It sounded really good to me. But that was an interesting learning experience. And that got me all the more interested in vintage instruments. And it was also starting the real height of the folk boom, the big folk boom, 59 to 63 was not Beatles, excuse me. It was Peter, Paul and Mary, Kingston Trio,
the folk music,
Bob Dylan, that kind of stuff. But that's not what I actually liked. What I liked was music that I heard some of my friends playing at Oak Park Forest High, and it was bluegrass and old-timey. And the University of Chicago had a folk festival every year, and they brought in a lot of bluegrassers. Early on, I got to hear Bill Monroe, Stanley Brothers, and that was Carter Stanley was still alive and well, and I got to hear all these people.
How amazing.
I heard blues players like Bucka White and Son House. I heard these people. And that's even before I ever played a guitar.
Right.
But I knew that was the music that spoke to me. When I was growing up, I was not interested in music very much at all until high school, when I heard this type, old time and bluegrass and old acoustic blues. I was not into electric music at all at that time. I remember hearing Elvis on the radio when he first came out. I did not like it one bit. But the music that I did hear that spoke to me got me wanting to play guitar. So it was in my freshman year of college, almost immediately, I decided I wanted a guitar. And again, my parents would give me a budget of $300. And I ended up finding there's a bulletin board at the University of Chicago in one of the buildings. I saw somebody was advertising the Conde Hermanos Classical made in Madrid. And I ended up buying it for $300. And it's a guitar that today would probably be worth at least $600 or $700. But back then it was $300.
Yeah.
And I took a few lessons from one of the students who was active in the Folklore Society, and Mark Greenberg, who went on to do quite a bit of interest in music. But it was pretty quickly apparent that I picked the wrong type of guitar. Classical guitar is not good for playing Carter family style. That's the kind of music that I really wanted to learn. And it's really some of the primary style that I still do now. But I traded it, and I got got a 1910 style O Gibson guitar with a Curl Q scroll. And it was really interesting looking, but it really didn't play and sound all that great, But all the kids, what they really wanted was a Martin D28. But when everybody has a D28, I'm pretty much contrarian. If everybody has one, I want something different. But the style O, it suited me sort of, but not as much as I'd like. But I found Greenberg, my teacher, had a F7 Martin arch top made in 37, 16 inches wide. Pretty fancy guitar. It cost more new than a D28 Herringbone did at the time. But it's, he wanted $75 for it, so I bought it. Times change.
Oh my gosh.
It could have been in 63. And it didn't suit me all that well, but I still had it for several years. I can remember but the first was the Cave Hermanos, second was the style O, the third was the F7. But I started looking around in pawn shops and music stores. I went to Sid Sherman's music. And in the meantime, though, I did find some bargains in pawn shops that I was looking to things I couldn't find much of what I wanted. Usually it was the ones I wanted were few and far between. But I could take the money that Mom and Dad gave me, the apartment rent, food, books, and spend it all on guitars, because the pawn shops would have stuff that I kept running into all this stuff I didn't want.
Right.
But it was cheap. And
and that's where you told me before we started the show too, George, where I thought, you had used, the guitars, moving the used and vintage guitars to put yourself through college. But no, your parents put you through college.
Oh, my parents.
You were just applying the money they gave you to accumulate guitars to sell.
That's right. I'd spend every penny they gave me on instruments, but within a week or two, I'd have all the money back to pay the bills. Plus, I could get to keep periodically, maybe once every couple of months, I could find something that I could keep. But the fourth guitar that I consider my guitar was I went into Sid Sherman's music in the Loop, and they had this Gibson arch top. It just had dots on the fingerboard. Simple white binding on the body. So the Gibson on the peg head and a flower pot inlay. 2 labels, and the regular serial number label on the other has signature from Lloyd Lord. So that they wanted $400 for it. And of course, jazz players there didn't want it because it wasn't cut away. It had this kind of big clubby neck, but I knew what it was. And I didn't have $400, but I put money down on it, and they held it till I could pay it off. And I did the same thing at the pawn shops often, too. I could control more guitars than I had money, because pawn shops back then, if it was a Martin or a Gibson, they pretty much automatically asked $100 for it, whatever it was. They didn't know one model from another. So it was an LGO Gibson, they wanted $100. And if it was a Super 400, they still wanted $100 because it was a Gibson. And they didn't want the same price for a Martin single 18 that they would for a D45. They didn't know what they had.
Right.
But I could put $15 or $20 down on one, and they'd hold it for the month. And pawn shops charge rapacious interest if you borrow money from them. But if you buy from them, they didn't charge any interest on that. I could buy a guitar, or I could put $15 or $20 down. They'd hold it for a month, and then as soon as I had money or I had a buyer who wanted that, I could bail it out. I never let one lapse. I always, if I put money down, I went through and bought every one of them. But I could control more guitars than I had cash at the moment. And it was a very different environment back then. There was also a shop called the Fret Shop that was walking distance from campus. And they specialized in used guitars. You have to keep in mind, in 1963, a 30-year-old guitar was 1933.
Right.
And today, a 30-year-old guitar is 1996.
Mm-hmm.
When I opened my store in 1970, a 30-year-old guitar was 1940.
Right.
And a 1960 Sunburst Les Paul, I opened January 2nd, 70. So a 10-year-old guitar would be January 2nd of 60. That could be a Sunburst Les Paul that today could be worth $300,000 or more.
It's just crazy because, I think about it too, George, to where, your store, when it was down on Broadway and everything, and back when you first opened it, and it was just always a place where musicians came. And just like, we'll talk about your new location too on 8th. That is just amazing. But it's like, how did you make that move to where, you had your degree, your graduate degree? I know there's some stories about you and Hank Williams Jr. and Sonny Osborne and everything, but you moved to Nashville in 1969, correct?
Beginning of the year, yes.
Okay.
What happened is I graduated from University of Chicago. Then I did a year of graduate work at Duke in Durham, North Carolina. And it was really hard to find good guitars down there too. Because in Chicago, there was money when those things were new,
Mm-hmm.
and people bought them. But
And musicians, a lot of musicians in
there
Chicago.
were a lot of musicians. But at one point in 65, when I was still going to University of Chicago, I drove to Nashville because I'd heard about Nashville. And I thought, wow, it's going to be like just guitars, like almost like trees with fruit. It was going to be so easy just picking them out. They were kind of just guitars all over. And it was anything, but it wasn't at all that way. There were very few music stores in Nashville. Hughley's Music was the one and only Gibson dealer. They were the exclusive Gibson dealer for Nashville. And they had every model of new Gibson, but they didn't have anything much used of interest. Showbud was in business, but they didn't have much used. And everything that they did have was used. They ran through their own repair shop, and it was everything they touched had the reverse Midas touch. If they worked on it, you touch it, and they could turn gold to crap. They ruined everything they worked on.
Oh, my gosh.
In fact, at one point, this was after I had my store, Shock Jackson was owner of Showbud. I went in there, and they had a Gibson hollow body, the early hollow body, double neck 6 and 12 string, that today is worth big money. And even then it was sought after collectible if you knew. But he had just refinished it white. And I asked if he owned it. Oh, yeah, we owned it. Well, why did you refinish it? Well, it had some scratches on it. And I said, well, what color was it originally with the sunburst? I said, well, if you'd left it alone, I would have paid a lot more than I would now for it. And he said, well, George, what's the problem? If you don't like it this way, I'll put the original finish back on for you. And no concept. What he meant is he could do it in sunburst.
Mm-hmm.
But what he said was, if you don't like it this way, I'll put the original finish back on. But anyway.
But, that goes back to also, George, to where, certainly with your repair shop and with Greg Voros and everybody, that you have working with you, to where, it's been a renaissance since you got into the business, to where on how vintage instruments are cared for and treated. And, and you and I have had many conversations too about, trying to leave them as original as possible, except when they must have work.
Well, I had a very definite model in mind when I opened the store. I wanted to set up a shop that treated guitars, banjos, and mandolins in much the same manner that classical violins are treated. That degree of respect for originality and collectability.
And it hadn't been done up until that point, George.
It had never been done. But my model in mind was Hill and Sons in London, which did appraisals, did expert repair, published books about violins, so they did education, and they were handling Stradivarius and Guarneri's and Amatis and fine instruments. And a certificate from Hill was considered worth gold so far as certification of authenticity. But I wanted to do that and give that degree of respectability, but we got circuitously out of what I was talking before. When I went down to Nashville, it was very disappointing, and this was in 1965. But I did go over to Hughley's Music, and I mentioned to the shop manager, Kim Broadus, that I wasn't finding anything. It was better in Chicago. And he says, well, yeah, I do know somebody you want to get a hold of. And he had a business card on his bulletin board, tacked on, and it was Mike Longworth. And Mike at that time was in Chattanooga, Tennessee. And later, he's known as the Martin guy who was their official historian. But at that time, in 65, Mike's family had a Planters Peanut franchise in Chattanooga. That's what he did. But I called that phone number. Nobody answered. And I asked Broadus, I said, well, how long does it take to get to Chattanooga? He said 4 hours. Well, there was no interstate then. It was 2-lane roads. You had to pass over Mont Eagle Mountain, and it was not an easy drive. Mm-hmm. I said, well, yeah, I'd be off at work or something, but there's nothing happening for me in Nashville. I'm just going to go down to Chattanooga. And I got there at about dusk. I dialed the number again. His wife answered. Mike's not home. He's in Asheville, North Carolina at the Asheville Music Festival. But she said I could come over and look at his collection anyway. She'd let me come over.
Oh my gosh.
And he had herringbone Martins. He had pearl trim Martins. He had quite a collection. Stuff that I didn't see in Chicago often. And I asked her, well, how long does it take to get to Asheville from here? 4 hours. And there was no interstate at that time, and that was over in the Smoky Mountains. Mm-hmm. Asheville's up in the mountains, and so the whole route just about was through mountains. And it was already dark, and it was winding little 2-lane roads that had no white lines on the roads, no street lights, not very many houses, so very few. So you're driving through this pitch dark, impossible to go much over 30 miles an hour. But you could always tell if somebody was coming around the bend because they kept their lights on, and you could see the light before the car appeared, because it was through pitch dark. So I went as fast as I could, and I got there about 2 a.m. And there was they were jamming out in the parking lot on a strip mall, and I saw people with master tone banjos and F5 mandolins, herringbone Martins, and I saw a guy with a D45, and there were no replica D45s much at that time, and it was real, and I knew that had to be Mike, so I just walked right up and said, hi, I was over at your house earlier this evening, and your wife said you'd be here. And I introduced myself, and he hit it off pretty well. He was a little taken aback that I'd been over at his house hanging out with his wife. But it was, we got to hit it off pretty well. And I also got to meet Tut Taylor and Randy Wood and quite few players. It was a life-changing experience. And this was something that was really, it just felt good. But
Well, and was that the turning
point coming at the end of the next week and a few days after this one? The other one saw it. That would be in Galax, Virginia. I said, well, how long does it take to get there?
Oh my gosh.
And they said 4 hours. But the thing is that was also just 2-lane roads, but it would be a few days in between. So I had to kill some time. And it was, I stopped at a motel in Withville, Virginia to spend the night on the way over to Galax. And in the morning, the local sheriff's car was parked next to mine. And I said, officer, is there any problem? And he says, well, the hotel owner called us and said that we have a car that has Illinois plates. It's a foreign car too. It was a Mercedes 190. Folks don't drive that kind of car. And, it's Illinois plates. I says, well, yeah. I says, well, what's the problem? He says, well, we've been having trouble lately with Yankee agitators coming down here, stirring up problems with the local, and he used an N-word. Are you one of them? I said, no, sir. And I didn't want him to examine my car because I missed sort of my hippie days a bit. I had some stuff in there I didn't want him to find. So I said, no, I'm going on to Galax. And I got out a guitar and I played him some Carter Family gospel tunes. And he thought that was okay. But at any rate, that was an interesting experience.
Well, and was that the turning point for you then, George, to where?
That was a turning point. Galax was amazing.
Okay.
And after
because I was wondering where the epiphany came that you needed to start a music store like you have.
Oh, that hadn't happened yet.
Yeah. My
interest was still in zoology, and I had every expectation of going through to get a PhD. And, I did get enrolled into Duke, but I was still at University of Chicago as an undergraduate when this that I'm still talking about.
Uh-huh.
But the point is, what I did find was there's a whole circuit of festivals. And I went to the first Bluegrass Festival for Bean Blossom, Indiana. And it was Monroe's Festival. I got to meet lots of people. And so I really found that I could do wheeling and dealing of instruments at those festivals. And one of the things I found is I could also trade with people, even in Chicago. If I found a jazz guitar or a Gibson Les Paul model, I wasn't interested in them, but I knew what they were. And I knew people who were interested in them. And if I found a jazz guitar and I found a jazz player who happened to have a Martin, they'd usually be delighted to trade. If they had a Herringbone D28 and I could find an L5 Gibson Archtop that was what was then a recent guitar, we're still talking about in the mid-60s,
right?
They'd be happy to trade.
Oh, yeah.
And in fact, while I was still a student at the University of Chicago, I got a call from one of the guys, a jazz player that I'd done some trading with before. And one day he called me. His name was Frank Rizzuto. And he said, George, I found this Martin guitar I got. And I just bought it. And it says, inside it says D45. Is that any good? And I said, yeah, that is. How much do you want for it? He said, well, I need to get $600 for it. I said, well, I can be there in 20 minutes. And so that was my first D45.
Oh my gosh. I got to ask you this question too, George. And I've never asked you this, but back in those early days when you were wheeling and dealing, through all these guitars and obviously, a lot of people didn't know what they had instrument wise, but when you would get a piece in, like a Martin D45 or something like that, did you have like repair friends? I mean, how would you get them repaired back then? Because there weren't
in Chicago,
shops.
Bosho Padunovac.
Okay.
Was and he actually was a reasonably competent repairman. And also Kagan and Gaines Music in Chicago they did quite a bit of vintage stuff. Now, they were viewing it as used guitars.
Right.
Because you have to figure that a guitar that was as old in 1970 as 1970 is from now would have been made in 1914. There were no dreadnought guitars yet.
And the mind shift too, George, and I want you to speak to this, to where back in the 70s and even in the 80s, an older vintage guitar was just an old guitar. People didn't. Not
true.
When do you think the transition happened?
We knew absolutely that there were people who knew perfectly well that a herringbone D was much better than a new Martin. And a flathead master tone was what they wanted. And a Lohr signed F5, they knew what it was. Now, they happened to be almost exclusively bluegrass players and old-timey players. And the acoustic market and the electric market were very separate. But there were people, even Harry West, who was in New York, was collecting pre-World War II Gibson mandolins and Martin guitars and Gibson banjos. He was starting to do that in the late 1940s.
Really? So it was all the bluegrassers then that started.
The bluegrassers were very aware that the new ones did not sound like the old ones. And they wanted the old ones. Even Monroe was playing on a Lohr F5. He couldn't get that sound on a new one. If you wanted to get that kind of chopped chord sound, there was nothing except a Lohr sign, or early, at least 1920s.
But it was like a very small group of people, though, wouldn't you say?
Well, the bluegrass community was not that small, and those festivals attracted a fair number of people. But the electric players really weren't that much into vintage until Mike Bloomfield was playing with Butterfield.
I agree.
When Bloomfield started playing with Butterfield, he was playing an early 60s slab board telly. And they went from being very little money, like $75, to hundreds of dollars. But when he switched to a Les Paul, he was playing a 54 gold top. And they went from $75 to $600 quick. But I could buy them on the South Side in pawn shop for $75 to $100. And I could just go to the North Side and I could sell them for $500 or more. And then when I was going to apply for graduate school, I did an interview at Rutgers University in Newark. That put me right across the river from New York. And I went over to 48th Street and I met Dan Armstrong at his shop. He had a little shop on the second floor building. And he was really interested in Les Pauls. And he would pay more than I could get in Chicago.
Oh my gosh.
But he also had a Stromberg Master 400. And I traded him a couple of Les Pauls for it. He thought he was coming out great, and I thought I was coming out great. But there were interesting deals to be had.
Well, and now, you have your collection of Strombergs on the third floor, right across
Well,
from your office.
I wouldn't say I have a collection of them. We have 2 of them right now.
The last time I looked at the Strombergs, you had 5, and I think also, didn't you work with Ranger Doug on that book for Stromberg?
Right. Yes. And Doug used to have 8 of them.
Mm-hmm.
Well, now he has 1. That's what can happen.
Phil Jones, you have a visitor at the front desk. Phil Jones.
You can tell it's a working guitar shop.
Yes. But basically, Doug has 1 Stromberg left after 6 marriages. He's on his 6th wife. And with divorces and child support, he now has 1 Stromberg. But he has his favorite one, which is it's a Stromberg Deluxe Cutaway. And it's a heck of a fine guitar.
Well, it's so funny to me, talking about how you came about, with Nashville and recognizing the need for a music store, like you ended up opening there in 1970. But also a lot of what you... Oh, go ahead, George.
I can easily tell you the timeline here.
Okay.
I did 1 year of graduate work at Duke because I did not like my interview at Rutgers. But fortunately, they paid my plane fare to come for the interview, so I got to see guitars instead. And I saw at that time Fretted Instruments in New York, where Mark Silber was there. I stopped at Manny's, where they had a Stromberg Deluxe Cutaway that I could have bought for $750, but I didn't want it at the time. But that would have been 67. So it's, but anyway, I ended up going to Duke for 1 year. I was not really very happy there. And I switched and went for a semester of graduate work at the University of Tennessee in Knoxville with lead professor Gordon Burkhart, who I had known when he was a graduate student at University of Chicago, specializing in reptile behavior, which suited me. And so I moved to Knoxville, studied there. And I'd been collecting snakes since I was 8 years old. But one of my projects when I was at University of Chicago studying animal behavior was studying feeding behavior of pit vipers. In one class, I had to do an original research project, which needed a 50-page term paper minimum. And we had to have a good bibliography, but their definition of research was not just to research, reading a bunch of papers and then doing something, an interpretation of what you had read. You had an experiment using live animals, but you came up with an experiment of your own. I picked and ate with Massasorbate rapid, and they had some very interesting behaviors. Like bite the mouse, that mouse will die soon. If you let them swallow it and it gets to its stomach, they won't be able more for the week. But if you present another one, while it's past its head, but not get to the tummy, they'll go after it. And if they do that, they'll eat it. And we can end up you eat far more. It's interesting their behavior, how their behaviors were triggered. Anyway, I was studying that. But the department chairman's wife found out that I had all one of the mistakes when animal lab. She was going to build a night taken my off-campus apartment, so I was sharing my bedroom with one or more pretty highly venomous snakes. But I have no venomous snakes in my office. I have 25 snakes in the office, but they're harmless. And the laws have changed. I couldn't have venomous snakes without having a zoo permit, and I don't run a zoo. So that's...
You run a zoo for guitars. That's totally...
Well, I am running an adoption agency for vintage instruments. We find guitars that need a home.
Mm-hmm.
I may have even been in an abusive home, and we fix them. We have the surgery department on the 3rd floor. We fix them, put them in good playing order, but you have to know what to do and what not to do and how to do it. So it requires not only skill, but it requires judgment. If you have skill, which is not linked with judgment, some people want to fix everything and make everything look new. That's not the goal.
No.
We don't strip off original finish, and we want to put it back to the maker's original specs. We don't want to hot rod it to do things it was never designed to do. We don't take original pickups off electric guitars. If a pickup is dead, we may rewind it. Or if the frets are severely worn, if it's too far to dress the frets, then we will refret, but we'll use the proper dimension wire.
Right.
If you are skillful enough, it can be virtually invisible, but we do disclose what we do.
Right.
So if a person is buying a guitar from us, we will give a very complete rundown of everything about it that's been done. And before I buy a guitar, it's not only a matter of price, but when we get it in, and somebody brings in a guitar for sale, or offered any guitar for sale, or banjo or mandolin, we'll ask them what they know about it, what the history is that they have. And one of the few things that Ronnie Reagan ever said that I thought was correct was trust but verify. And everything needs a forensic exam before we will pay for it. Even if we're taking it on consignment, the customer doesn't care if we own it or if it's a consignment. They want to know what it is, and our reputation depends on that. It can take years to build up a reputation, and if you don't treat people well, it can take very little time to lose a reputation.
Right.
But I still feel very firmly the golden rule: do unto others as you would have them do unto
Chris,
you.
please call 311. Chris, please call 3.
Treat people the way you would want to be treated if you
Right.
were in their position.
Well, and that's how you touched on a thing too, George, with appraisals, to where, you and Gruhn Guitars have become so well known for that. But I know when I was in the shop the other day, it was brought up to where a whole new area for you has become online appraisals that has really
A lot of
exploded in the
online
past.
appraisals, but the online appraisals very clearly state that it is done based on the attached photos. And we have a disclaimer that we can't, that it does not reveal as much as an in-person inspection could.
Right.
And these days, there's the availability that we didn't used to have of forensic testing, very much similar to what medical laboratories have, where any forensic pathologist would have. There now is an outfit in Nashville, Vintage Verified, has hundreds of thousands of dollars of equipment. They can examine the finish on a guitar, tell you even layer by layer what
Chris, please call 311.
is, and often enough even how old the finish is and even the manufacturer.
Wow.
So, for example, in the 60s, those custom color fenders, coat paints, and we had one that we appraised in what was supposed to be 1962 Stratocaster surf green, and the finish looked beautiful. The routing on the body, some of the routes was just a little off.
Oh.
But at any rate, the finish upon inspection with the correct equipment turned out to be not Duco, but Mohawk. And it was a chemical formula they used only in the 70s and 80s. So it could not be a 1962 finish. and their equipment is sensitive enough that even if it had 1 or 2 parts per million of original finish left, it would register. There was absolutely no evidence whatever that this body had ever had any finish other than the one that was on it. So that leads to the conclusion that the body is not even a Fender body.
And that is so forensics, because I know, I've sent so many people to you over the years, George, for appraisals, whether it be for insurance or just so that they know, and to where you have, you and your team have been able to point out a number of things on an instrument, whether it is changed out pickups or changed out, machine heads, finish, the list goes on and on. But a lot of people just don't know these deeper details. And it just goes back to your books also that you've done over the years, George, to where I have, your past published books, and I use those as guides even when I was buying, selling, and trading instruments, because it was the only way at the time before, the internet, and there's still wrong stuff on the internet. But with your books, you could verify what a particular model was.
But keep in mind that verification, the book, you can use the identification key, but it's not going to tell you whether it's a skilled forgery or whether it's the real deal.
Mm-hmm.
That requires further inspection.
Right.
The forgers are getting better and better all the time. And if you publish a book or article outlining step by step what to look for, the first people who are going to buy that will be the forgers themselves.
Right.
And they will be very careful.
Kyle Forrester, line 2. Kyle, line.
All the features that you said to look for, they'll be careful to copy that.
Right. Well, I wanted to ask you a question too, George.
Forgeries is good, but the forensic examinations that we are talking about, we don't have that equipment here in-house. We use the Vintage Verified company that is in Nashville, and this is only within the past year.
Wow.
So
that's amazing.
I'm not claiming that we are totally infallible. Anybody who claims to be totally infallible,
I think you have a pretty good eye.
Is either a con man or delusional. If you believe that you're infallible, you're delusional.
Totally.
I cannot claim that we are absolutely perfect, but I can claim that it's incredibly rare for us to have one come back to bite us.
Right.
But
and I've got to ask you this, George, because you're
claims that they can't. Yeah, I was talking to a New York dealer 20-some years ago, and I was mentioning that the custom color fenders are getting harder and harder to really feel confident on. It's the quality of fakes, such as it used to be, if it was refinished, it looked like barn paint applied with a broom. And if it was factory quality, it was real. Well, it's not that way anymore. But anyway, this dealer told me, George, you're just getting old and just losing your confidence. He says, I don't have any trouble telling an original from one refinish. I've never been fooled by one. Well, there's a problem with that statement. If none came back to bite him, how would he know he'd never been fooled?
Exactly.
The good enough quality. I was talking to Tom Murphy, who's very well known for doing finishes.
Oh, yeah.
The Murphy Lab stuff at Gibson is Tom Murphy. And he said, yeah, that's an interesting statement. I said, he said that, let me give you an example that happened to me. I was at a guitar show. I saw a candy apple red 60s Stratocaster. I had a friend who was looking for one. This one was priced right, where I could get it for my friend. And, it looked fine. And he said, I'm confident. I look at finishes all the time. And I'm pretty sure I can tell. But at a show, I can't just take the whole thing apart. I have to the dealers are not going to let you take it all apart and go through everything. Anyway, he got it back home, and the pots were a little scratchy, so he wanted to at least spray some cleaner in there, get it, so he set it up well. So to do that on a Strat, you have to you lift the pick guard. And when he lifted the pick guard, there was an autograph inscribed into the finish under the pick guard, would be seen only if you take it apart. And some people just write their own name in one just for identification later if it ever gets stolen and their name's on it. But this one had a rather ironic name on it. It was autographed, signed by Tom Murphy, the way he does when he refinishes one. So his own refinish of a few years previous that had some real playing wear on it now fooled him, because his specialty is doing finishes that look like the original. So, but he would generally mark them so that it couldn't easily be passed off as original.
Wow.
But his own refinish fooled him. And not everybody who does refinishing bothers to mark them in any such way.
Right.
But the point is, more and more forensic testing is important, especially when things are getting as expensive as some of them are now. Right. Things that back when I started out in 1970, a good herringbone D28 from 1937 would be about $800, but today they're over $200,000 for a really clean one.
Right.
And
just like a 59 Les Paul. I can't believe how much 59 Gibson.
Well, back then they were $800 to $1,000 in 1970, and a nice clean 59 dot neck ES335 would have been $400, and today a really clean one can be $80,000 to $100,000. Right. So times have changed, but it also means that prices on some of these things are now high enough that they're mainly bought by rich boys who are not necessarily going to play them. They want them for display rather than for play. And they want things that you can put in a glass case and have bragging rights. But if it's scratched up a bit, they don't want it. But if you have the scratched up so-called player grade that costs 1/4 as much, in some cases, 1/4 as much might be $50,000. You can have one that plays every bit as well as the one that costs 4 times as much. But the collectors, they don't feel it doesn't have enough bragging rights for them. But the players don't pay $50,000 for anything. They don't have $50,000.
Right. So, George, if you could, kind of how did you and Gruhn Guitars become like the epicenter for so many A-list musicians to come in and buy guitars, mandolins, banjos, everything from you? How did that happen? Because as we were talking about, having been in the store a number of times when these people come in, I remember the story, even I think it came out in a magazine, George, to where Brad Paisley got a big check for one of his songs, and he specifically came to you to buy his Dream Martin at that time.
Well, I've been dealing with celebrity players for quite a long time, even including, I knew Michael Bloomfield, and even when I was at the University of Chicago, a lot of the people I was dealing with were professional musicians. But I got to Nashville because that I was already dealing with pro players. But when I was at Knoxville in graduate school one day, I got a call from Hank Williams Jr., who told me that Sonny Osborne of the Osborne Brothers, Opry stars, had told him about me because they'd met me at music festivals, and that Hank was collecting guitars and had a budget to do it. So I got a call that pretty much was me pick up the phone. Hello? I said, this is Hank Williams Jr. Sonny Osborne told me about you. He said, you have Martins for sale and other interesting guitars. Tell me what you have. And I started telling him a few. He said, well, I can be there in 4 hours. And everything seemed to be 4 hours back then, but there was no interstate.
Because there was no interstate.
So in Knoxville at that point, and he did indeed show up in 4 hours. He was driving a Jaguar E, and since this would have been in 1968, that was a British made with Lucas electronics and leather washers. I mean, the wonder is, A, he got there in 4 hours with no interstate highway at the time, and B, he didn't have a British trained mechanic to keep that car running because those things were not reliable. But he had one guitar with him that he wanted to get rid of. It's a 1939 42 Mark, 0042, but it had been repaired and refinished by Showbud, and it was a horrible job. But he bought everything that his car would hold, which gets down to 3 guitars, because a Jaguar E is no good for hauling lots of guitars. It doesn't have room.
But it's a pretty car.
But he did get 3 instruments. I did reluctantly take the 0042 in trade, but I didn't give him much for it. And I was not selling any of my pearl trimmed Martins. I would sell style 18s or style 28s, even herringbone trimmed ones. I was selling some good guitars, but the pearl trimmed Martins were what I personally collected. I consider those to be not for sale.
Right.
They were my collection, and I had collection and dealing stock, and the dealing stock was what I would sell. At any rate, he said, well, I can be back tomorrow with a bigger car. And he came back the next day with a bigger car, and he had a Cadillac Eldorado, and he bought what that would hold. I still had more. I had one room that was pretty much about 3 feet deep in guitar cases.
Oh my God.
I didn't have a store, but I had plenty of guitars. This was when I was at graduate school in Knoxville. And he said, Nashville doesn't have anybody like you. And if you come, I can help you start a music store. And I'll even have an apartment waiting for you if you decide to come. Well, I wasn't ready to drop out of school yet.
Right.
But by the end of the year, I was getting pretty disgusted with the academic scene. It was becoming increasingly evident that even if I could get a PhD in reptile behavior, there's no money in it. And getting grants to study reptile behavior is not as easy as getting grants for medicine or other research that more people care about.
Right.
So I called Hank and said, I'm ready. He did indeed have an apartment waiting, but as soon as I got there, he said that, you need to get to know the town a little bit. So we're not going to start right away, but he helped to support me for the first year I was in town.
Wow.
Because he bought enough instruments from me for his own collection to pretty much finance what I did.
Right.
And I was meeting a lot of people. I opened a store with Tut Taylor as a business partner. As you may recall, I met Tut and Randy Wood when I went to that first festival in Asheville. And Tut and I were equal partners when we started. And Randy was an employee, but we called it GTR Incorporated, an abbreviation for guitar, and George, Tut, and Randy.
How awesome.
Tut was a Mormon who had 8 kids, and it was becoming quickly obvious that it wasn't going to work out. He wasn't going to make enough money at it.
Yeah.
And what Tut and Randy really wanted to do, Tut had been a professional sign painter, but he also had a guitar repair shop. And Randy had worked for him, and Bob Gibbons had worked there previous to that. They wanted to do custom work for Gibson. And we, even before opening the store, we visited in Kalamazoo. We went up, and that would have been in 1969. We visited the Gibson factory, and they were interested in doing reissues of the Florentine and All-American banjos, and they wanted somebody who could carve the necks and resonators and do the painting for those, because they had painted patterns as well as carving. Right. Randy did carving and Tut did painting, and they even sent down a spindle carving machine for us to practice using. It was a small one, but it's almost like a 3D pantograph, not computerized at all. It's just you move the stylus over and it can carve patterns, but nowhere near as precise as what can be done today with some CNC machines, computer numeric control. At any rate, we opened the store, and it became pretty quickly evident that while we could do the carving and painting, Gibson wanted it at a price that was below what it cost us to do the work. It wasn't going to work out for us. And what's more, the shop was not going to pay enough to make Tut's family even at a sustainable level, because he was Mormon with 8 kids. And I, on the other hand, was single and had an apartment.
Right.
So Tut sold his share of the business to me in September 1970, and then I was the sole owner after that. But I kept the name GTR Incorporated. Randy Wood worked for me for 3 years. And then in 73, Randy and Tut decided that they could open their own store. They set up the Old Time Pick and Parlor. And I think they had in mind that they could outcompete me. It didn't quite work out that way, because Tut stayed in that situation for only a few months and left. And Randy still kept the store, but never really was serious competition for me.
Right.
And
so with the logo with Freddie, who drew Freddie?
I drew Freddie.
So you drew that logo by hand?
Yeah. How else would I do it back then in 1970? If I want to draw Freddie, I can do Freddie. And here's a blank piece of paper. Now let's see if I can draw Freddie right now.
You ought to just, I need you to draw one of those for me, and just so I can have it for my guitar room, George.
Well,
because I got the t-shirt.
Here's Freddie.
I don't know.
That is incredible.
Well, that's a little crude, but
that is incredible.
Good.
And that's the logo on hats, t-shirts, building. Do you feel like, George, and with vintage guitars, and certainly with the commercial that was so big years ago that was shot in your Gruhn guitar shop, and with all of the documentaries and everything else that you've been involved in over the years,
Boyd.
It looks great. So do you feel like you've kind of become like a vintage guitar superstar? I mean, like when I see you at the Opry and you're carrying guitars around, and Steve Warner has told me that sometimes it's not good when you're there, because then he buys more guitars and gets in trouble when he goes home. But you're kind of like a superstar with vintage instruments now, George.
Well, yeah, I certainly do go to the Opry as much as 2 or 3 times a week. I was there last night. And I always do take at least one instrument. And it's true that frequently enough, I do business back there. But I don't, I'm just me. I don't, when people say I'm a legend, I don't want to be legendary, because legendary often means not even real. I want to be real.
Right.
And, but I'm just me.
The Opry now to me seems kind of like the festivals you used to attend back in the 60s, to where you would go, and meet people and trade, buy, sell instruments. And the Opry is kind of that way. And even with what you've done now with the sessions on Third, to where you're having these shows featuring artists, but then also you have some of Gruhn Guitars instruments, at Third and Lindsley for these shows.
Well, yeah, we're starting a series of presentations of instruments, talking about instruments, and I like to do question and answer session. So I like to do just about as long on question and answer as on any other presentation. But for example, I just did one Tuesday of this week. I took an Orville Gibson guitar made in about 1900, before Gibson was incorporated, and it was still just a one-man operation. And I took a Lore Sign 1924 L5, which incidentally I bought from the daughter of the original owner. She's now in her 90s, but she remembers her father playing it, but Dad died when she was 5 years old, and then the guitar went into the closet, and it stayed there, so the guitar looks almost new. I still have that certain guitar I don't want to sell. But no, I took a 1922 Gibson Martin single 045, which is a design that's very similar to what they were doing even by the late 1840s. They hadn't changed the design much, and I took a 1930 OM28. The OM28 came out in late 29. It was their first 14-fret model, 14 frets clear of the body.
Right.
And it's essentially the predecessor of virtually all modern design steel string flat top acoustics. So I talked about those.
I love that.
At Third and Lindsley, and then took question and answer. I don't use any script whatever. I talk pretty much just off the cuff. And on question and answer, there's no way to be. You don't have a script for that.
Right.
The preparation for answering questions is 60 years of experience, and the ability to talk coherently without a script, and have the knowledge that it takes to answer the question. And sometimes the questions aren't really even the best of questions, but usually you can turn it into something like, if you could only have one guitar, what would it be? My answer is, it's very problematic to have more than one wife at a time, but I prefer a harem of guitars. They get along well together, and there's so many different kinds of guitars. There is no one that does everything. A session player is going to have at least 10 guitars, and you need a flat top steel string guitar that's good for finger picking, a different one that's good for bluegrass style flat picking.
Right.
You need a resonator guitar. You need a nylon strung guitar. You probably want to have an acoustic F-hole arch top for jazz. And then you also, in electrics, you're going to probably want a Les Paul style guitar, a Telly style guitar, a Strat style guitar, a semi-hollow body electric, a fully hollow electric. And by the time you get them, we're going to have at least 10 guitars.
Exactly.
A session player needs that. It doesn't mean they're a collector. Just because a plumber has lots of wrenches doesn't mean he's a wrench collector. There are people who collect tools.
Right.
But people who want to collect vintage tools going back from the earliest human history to the present, that's interesting, but plumbers don't do that. They want utility tools.
Right.
And
But
most
also
veterans-
guitars, as you and I know, George, they're playable artwork. And I was going to bring up your relationship with Martin Guitars. And I know also that Gruhn, you carry, you're the only place that you can buy the Steve Earle model Martin, because I've been in there in your store when Steve has come flying in the door, had to grab one and go play the opera. And then also all of the other models that have with Martin that have your specs, George, just like the one behind me. And you were able to work with Martin Guitars to build Gruhn Guitar specific models.
Well, yes, we do that. And but guitars, I like to point out that guitars have soul and personality. And what makes a guitar good, first and foremost, is design. Second would be structural workmanship. Third would be materials. And fourth would be ornamentation, because ornamentation doesn't make it sound good, but it does help to make it pretty and sell better.
Mm-hmm.
Pretty ones sell better than ugly ones. But you can have great workmanship, great materials, beautiful ornamentation, but if there's any design flaws, it doesn't work.
Right.
It's just like if you're in an airplane 40,000 feet up in the air, if there's an aerodynamic design flaw or any structural design flaw or even an electrical issue, that's a big oopsie. It doesn't work and you could die, at least with the guitar. If there's a design flaw, nobody dies, but it may not really perform well.
Right.
Or it may be structurally unstable and have problems. But you can build a remarkably good guitar with mediocre materials if the design is really good.
Mm-hmm.
And a Telecaster or a Stratocaster is a pretty good example. The Telecaster Fender, when it came out, was not better built than a Martin or a Gibson acoustic, but it did things they couldn't do.
Exactly.
And when it comes to selling, you can sell based on price, based on quality, or based on innovation and versatility. If you have a situation in which you're just trying to make the cheapest possible one, you might sell a bunch, but it's hard to be profitable. Besides, there's always somebody who's going to come along and try to out-compete you on that, even if they lose money.
Right.
So far as competing on strictly on quality, you get to a point where it's almost like automobiles. If you have a car that can do 150 miles an hour and you can design one that can go 200 miles an hour, neither one is going to be able to be demonstrated on our roads here.
No.
We don't need a Ferrari or a Lamborghini to drive to and from work. In fact, they're rather ill-suited to it. They have about 2 inches of road clearance, and if you hit a pothole, it's going to really damage things. And if you do anything that's fun behind the wheel, you get flashing blue lights and tickets, or worse yet, if you lose control, you wreck the machine, and with you in it, that might wreck you.
Right.
And it might even be where you have an accident and you hit a car that has a family of 6 and you take them out with you. See, with guitars, no matter if it doesn't work, nobody dies.
Right.
And with a guitar also, if you try some maneuver on it and it doesn't work, you can try it repeatedly and repeatedly. And if it's a good idea, it may take 1,000 times to figure out how to pull it off. But if you're in gymnastics or skiing, the long jumps or the ones where you flip in the air, or motorcycles or bicyclists where they're doing that, I don't see how the heck they practice that and get to do it without dying in the process of learning.
Mm-hmm.
With the guitar, you can try out all these things. And, it works.
It has to feel great for you, though, George, when you're at the Opry, when you're at a lot of these festivals, and you're at the Ryman, you get invited everywhere. I bump into you at a number of these events as you are invited. And to see the artist, the top level artist in the music industry playing instruments from you. That has to feel gratifying.
It is good. But, I like to work also with kids who are interested. If they ask intelligent questions, even if they don't have any money, I'll take the time to spend. If they're asking intelligent questions, I want to meet them. Mm-hmm. Besides, occasionally what happens is the 9-year-old kid may not have any money, but mommy and daddy do. And they sometimes buy some very good instruments. And I do encounter kids, even at 8 or 9 years old, who have incredible talent and potential. But guitars have soul and personality.
And stories.
And a really good one becomes a musical partner. They're not simply, they don't feel inanimate. The good ones feel alive. And they do become a partner. They suggest things you might not have thought of otherwise. Mm-hmm. And a good example really can be Bill Monroe and the F5 mandolin. Right. He invented a whole new genre of music after he got the F5, but you couldn't play that style on any other mandolin that was available at that time. Now there's other people making copies or clones of F5s, mm-hmm. and you can get some of that type tone that the previous mandolins in the period pre-World War II, there was only one maker and one model. Only the F5 would do that sound.
Right.
But a lot of times instruments today are used for types of music and sounds that the original designers never dreamed of. Leo Fender never dreamed of what James Burton would be doing, or Lloyd Buchanan, or really go on Buck Owens.
Right.
But surely Jimi Hendrix didn't occur to him.
No.
And they're not, Leo sent everything out with flat wound strings with a wound third and wouldn't bend notes on that. And even though Les played jazz, he didn't bend notes. Mm-mm. He played with flat wound strings.
Right.
They didn't envision folks like Slash or Clapton but the good instruments are versatile enough that they can become a musical partner. Mm-hmm. And whole new genres of music happen not only because musicians are asking for something, but often enough the maker designs something and it ends up inspiring musicians to do things that the maker never dreamed of.
Right.
Even violins were designed for Baroque chamber music. Mm-hmm. And they didn't, Stradivari didn't envision Paganini or even modern symphonic music.
Right. But what I was going to bring up, even with Eric Clapton, when he was in town on his last tour, and I saw him here in Nashville, he had to stop by and visit you at the guitar shop before he hit the road again.
Yes, he did. And
that's a nice compliment.
Well, he, not only that, but he gave me a nice present. I don't know if I have it right here in my pocket. In fact, I wasn't wearing it today, but he collects silver and gold jewelry by Goro Takahashi. And these are very difficult to get. The only place to get them is the shop in Tokyo.
Oh my God.
You can't mail order one. And they are not cheap. And he gave me this as a gift the last time he was in Nashville.
How amazing.
I wear it quite frequently, and I was wearing it last night backstage at the Opry. Because last night was my 81st birthday.
A great way to celebrate.
Well, 81 feels exactly the same as 80.
Well, you're still spry. You're still, when I'm at the store, you haven't slowed down any, George. It seems like you're in more demand. And just like with this Sessions on Third, it's going so well. Do you think you're going to be doing more of these going forward?
Absolutely.
Okay.
No, they're fun. And they don't really require any preparation other than 60 years of experience. That's it. I can talk. And if they had so far as question and answer sessions, there's no way to prepare for that other than have the experience. But also, sometimes the question is going to produce a response from me that is not what they expected.
Mm-hmm.
I don't want to have only one type of guitar. And I don't judge the merits of instruments only by how much money they bring. If you're collecting, I want to see a theme to a collection. There should be a reason why it tells a story. You can study the evolution of a design, and you can have even a Fender Broadcaster and a Fender Nocaster and a Telecaster and different variations.
Right.
But if you simply do nothing but collect or accumulate Sunburst Les Pauls all from the year 1959, so far as I'm concerned, that's not really a collection. That's an accumulation, especially if you are buying them as an investment, which means you're going to sell them. Art collectors, typically the great collectors, didn't buy them to sell. And when they died, it often would go as a donation to a museum.
Right.
But they didn't want to break up the collection.
Mm-hmm.
If somebody comes in and says, I'm a collector, and by the way, it's been so much fun, I've been just having a blast, and it's been one of the most profitable things I've ever done. Well, he just told me he's not a collector, he's a speculator.
Right.
There are buyers who are utility tool users, or buyers who truly are collectors, and there are speculators.
Mm-hmm.
And another category also is memorabilia collectors, where they don't really care about the guitar at all,
right,
other than to certify who owned it and what they did with it. So, things like David Gilmour's Stratocaster, it's just a 70s Stratocaster. It's highly modified
mm-hmm.
and in poor condition, and it brought $14 million at auction. Well, if it was an identical guitar owned by Joe Blow in the same condition, the general reaction we'd have is, oh, what a shame that some idiot did this. But it's often enough I buy guitars that have sometimes been abused a bit, but I feel like I'm rescuing them from a bad home.
Right.
And do what I can to rescue it, resuscitate it. And at least our surgery department upstairs, you can put a guitar in suspended animation. You just loosen the strings, keep it at the right temperature and humidity. If you don't know how to fix it right away, and it may take 3 years to figure it out, you can just effectively have it in suspended animation, and there it is. You can't do that with a live animal or a human.
No.
So there's a limited amount of time you can keep them under anesthesia.
Right.
But I still view the repair department almost as a hospital.
Mm-hmm. And you had such a great team there also, George.
Yeah. Well, this is not a one-man show. My stepson, Eric, is the major shareholder in the company, but I continue to own the building. But at this point, I come in every day to do fun stuff. And
that's a good gig.
Yeah, I think so. It's my padded playpen.
Well, and especially with your family's longevity, you've got to kind of figure out what you're going to do for the next 20 to 30 years, George.
Well, I don't expect to live 20 necessarily, but what I do want to do is have quality of life where every day is utilized. I want the maximum amount of fun per day. And to me, fun and productivity happen to be closely related. Just laying around on the beach, nah, I'm not interested.
No. Going
fishing, well, I know I do have the snook on the wall there behind me.
Yes, you do.
And that was with Duke Sells, who was the fishing guide out of Captiva Island, right next to Sanibel. And I did go out with him every year back in the 70s. And the first time we went out, I got to talking with him. It turned out he had a 1953 D28 Martin, and I bought it. I made more money on the fishing trip than he did. It's rare that you go with a fishing guide. I wouldn't have caught any fish. I'm good at catching frogs and turtles and snakes. I'm not very good as a fisherman, but what I did get was a D28. And the next year I went and he had a 1954 RB250 Master Tone Banjo Gibson.
Oh my goodness.
I got that.
You're like a magnet, George. You are a magnet for incredible instruments. They just seem to like move towards you, you know?
Well, I'm always looking.
Right.
But I still, I have a curiosity. And when people can go in a room and see the exact same thing, and what they remember is different. What they focus on is different. Like I told you about Tut and Randy and me and GTR Incorporated. Well, Tut left after September of 1970, but in 1970, second weekend in August, it's the Galax, Virginia Festival. Tut, Randy, and I went together. We had a Chevy van. It was a short van, but it was still a van.
Yeah.
It only had 2 bucket seats, but Tut and Randy built a bed in the back that had like that much space. It was enough you could lay on the bed and you could take a nap, but under that you could put instruments. Well, we were driving. I was driving behind the wheel at that time, going through Knoxville, heading to Nashville, leaving Galax and going back to Nashville. And I was going about 60 miles an hour because it was the one section. There was interstate 4-lane divided highway in Knox County and also in Davidson County, Nashville. But in between, it was all 2-lane roads. Well, I know that we were on the interstate section. And 60 miles an hour is about 88 feet a second. And the fovea of the eye can only focus on a small area with good focus. Well, I saw a hitchhiker at the side of the road. The hitchhiker was holding a Gibson A model mandolin case made no earlier than 1910 and no later than 1930. And A models that then were about $75 and we had plenty of them. And we didn't have room. Randy was on the bed. He could see out front. Tut was sitting next to me. So I drove by and they screamed, "Why didn't you stop?" I said it was an A model. If it was an F model, at least, they might be, hitchhikers often need money. I would have stopped to see if they want to sell it.
Right.
But it was an A model. And then they told me it was a beautiful girl in a mini skirt. I don't know.
You were more concerned with the instrument.
Well, my brain is just programmed to see that. And,
yeah, but I got to bring this up though too, George. Every time I bump into you at NAMM show, whenever we're out there together in Anaheim, California, you always have so much fun. You're like a kid in a candy store out there, and then people are coming up and showing you stuff, wanting your opinion. They're showing new instruments to you or vintage instruments to you, and you are like a rock star of vintage guitar instruments wherever you go, whether it's the NAMM show or Opry or Ryman or Sessions on Third. It's like, but you enjoy it, George.
Well, I do, but I also look at zoological and botanical stuff. And one time I was walking just less than a block away from my shop when it was on Broadway, and people were just walking past this building, and I stopped and was fascinated. It was a mating pair of black widow spiders in courtship right there in a crevice in the corner of the building. But I see these things. My eye picks that up, and that's what I zero in on, that kind of stuff.
That's good.
It's different people see different things.
Mm-hmm.
And that's just the way it works.
Well, it's great having you on the show, George. I want to make sure for everyone that's watching or listening to the Gear Gab podcast that you are going to be doing more of the sessions on Third, so they can go to your website, Third and Lindsley here in Nashville, Tennessee. I know you've got a lot more plans for guitars, with some exciting news coming out as always, as you always do, with everything. I think you probably need to do like a new book or something too, George.
Well, we're doing social media as well. So it's not all just me. It's not a one-man operation.
Right.
But the Third and Lindsley presentations are likely to be weekly.
Right.
And they are fun. And I enjoy doing that. I'm also involved with Belmont University on their Musical Instrument Museum.
Which is incredible. I remember when they installed that. I was there. I think you and I spoke when they first got the collection, and you helped curate that for them on the Belmont campus, correct?
Well, it was a customer of mine who had 500 and some odd instruments who was terminally ill, and I helped him write his will because as it was, he knew all about who he didn't want to get them, but he didn't know who he did want to get them. And I had suggested the possibility of a museum.
Mm-hmm.
And we found that Belmont was receptive to that, but Vince Gill helped convince the president of the university that this would be a good thing.
Right.
So it didn't happen only on my own word. I have a lot of friends in Nashville. This is a really unique city. There's more concentration of musicians and musical opportunities in a 30-minute driving radius than almost any other place in the world.
Right.
Now, LA or New York have a lot of musicians, but LA, you could spend 3 hours or more just driving from one part of the greater LA area to another.
Right.
Even in New York, getting from one area to other, it's not concentrated in any one area. In Nashville, it's concentrated. That's why even going to Belmont, they have a music department and they have a music business department. But the thing is that not only do you have access to the university itself,
right,
but you're not in the middle of nowhere. It's a thriving music community where you get to partake of all of that. Mm-hmm. And the jam sessions and the exposure you have is much more than just the classroom.
Definitely, especially that close to city grow, and you're in Music City.
I don't believe I could do what I do in almost any other city anywhere. Mm-hmm. But that's just the way it is. I'm still having a pretty good time. And I feel
so.
good.
It seems like it, George.
Well, I zip up the stairs 2 at a time. My dreams, I'm about 35. And I still am physically able to do almost anything I want.
Right.
The few things I can't do are things I didn't want to do anyway.
Right.
So, and I have a good staff.
Incredible staff.
It's, I'm having a good time. I do recognize that at age 81, I have fewer years ahead than behind me, but I am having just as much fun, if not more, each day than I ever did. And I still do projects that may take years to really do. Nothing's complete anyway. It's a journey. In a company like this, we constantly have to adapt to a changing environment. And there's a lot of great stuff going on, but the fact is, right now, the quality of new instruments is so good that bang for buck is hardly anything used made in the past 50 years that's as good as what you can buy brand new at that price. Mm-hmm. But the true golden era for electrics is in the 50s to the mid 60s. And for the acoustics, For mandolins, it's in the 20s. For banjos, it's more in the 30s. For acoustic flat top guitars, it's about, for Martin,
Kyle, line 1. Kyle.
1928 through about late 38 is the absolute golden era. But in some cases, second best is what's made right now. And they're good enough to take on stage and use professionally anywhere. Whereas in 1970, the quality of the new ones was such that it helped to promote used ones. And the used ones were still affordable that musicians, working musicians, could afford them.
Right.
But if something like a 1937 D28 was over $200,000 now for a really clean one,
right.
But the collectors don't want one that doesn't look good in a glass display case, and they want bragging rights. So if it's scratched up and used looking, they don't want that.
Right.
That's player grade. But if
which is player's grade is what I prefer.
Quarter as much.
Right.
The problem with a quarter as much as 200,000 is still $50,000, and you know what? Players don't have 50,000. So if the player grade is now priced beyond what players can afford, but the rich boys don't want it, we got a dilemma.
Yeah,
we are selling more new instruments than we ever did.
Totally.
And the new instruments are definitely good enough to be used professionally, especially if a lot of the people now have a wire coming out the end pin. And if you have a wire coming out the end pin, you don't need the best instrument. But when I
Kyle, line 1.
When I
Kyle.
judge acoustic instruments, I listen for 5 separate things. So that people talk about tone is subjective. It really isn't. First, people talk about balance. Well, there's different kinds of balance. Balance of volume. If you have a 6-string guitar, you want to have with equal pressure on strings and up and down the board. Equal pressure gives you equal volume. Right. That's one type. But we also need balance of sustain. If you play a 6-note chord and we just let it go, do some notes linger longer than others, or do some die quick and others go on? The desirable is that they stay equal. Then we want balance of dynamic range, soft, medium, and loud. Most guitars or many instruments, you can play soft or medium, but if you really drive it hard, they just distort. They don't get louder, they just go into distortion, right? And it's not good and usable. The really great ones have incredible range, and it's hard to overdrive them. They just keep putting out. Then we want balance of harmonic complexity. Every note has a fundamental, but what gives it tonal character is the harmonics. And if you have a rich set of harmonics, that's great. That's what good tone often has. Well, actually, by definition, it just about has to have it. But harmonic complexity is what gives it its tonal character. And even, for example, like a mandolin and a mandola, or a violin and a viola, 3 of the 4 strings are the exact same pitch. But the harmonics are different. So if you play a passage on just the 3 strings, right, on a violin and a viola, or a mandolin and a mandola, you can tell the difference. And you can do that on wind instruments, clarinet and oboe, the same pitch. You can play a piece of sheet music that's the exact same notes. You can play it on an oboe and a clarinet, and they don't sound the same.
Right.
The harmonics are cool. And great instruments are black. And the other thing they also have is clarity of articulation. Some instruments are funky and fuzzy sound on them. That is that crisp and clear. You can take a crisp, clear note into the palm of your hand. You can make it simply. But if it's stumpy, fuzzy was no one that you do all that. When even in the studio, you can always make things sound fuzzy and distorted. You can do that in concert. But if you have a fuzzy, distorted sound, you can't make this and do that. So good instruments have tones that you can actually listen for. I mean, you'll still get different tones out of a mahogany guitar versus a rosewood guitar versus a maple guitar. But you can have great instruments that do all five things and still, but if they don't do those five, they ain't great. But that's basically it. Balance of volume, balance of sustain, balance of dynamic range, balance of harmonic complexity, and balance of the clarity of articulation. You can listen for that, and it's measurable. Those are not subjective. You can measure it, and you can also hear it, and you can listen for it. And when it has those features, it's good.
That's incredible. Well, I want to give a shout out also to Acoustic Coffee Company, which I know that your lead luthier and repair person, Greg Boros, is with them, to where people who are watching or listening to Gear Gab, if you use Gear Gab as a code word, you get 20% off your first coffee. Yeah. And I know they do a lot of work with Greg there as well.
Yeah, Greg is no longer the sole repair shop manager. Actually, Tony Nagy is, and Greg is working part-time, but still doing a lot of promotion, a lot of technical insights. So Greg's still very active. But on a day-to-day basis, Tony is now the repair shop foreman, and Greg still works here.
Awesome. Well, George, I can't thank you enough for coming on the show and sharing with us about all the great things going on at Gruhn Guitars, giving us some of the history, talking about sessions on Third. And I'm sure you're going to have some other great things coming out. So I know that our viewers and listeners will want to follow you on the website and on social media, and check out all the other great things you're doing, George.
You know, keep in mind, too, it's a very simple website to remember. It's just guitars.com. That cost $30 when I got it, which is one of the few advantages of being old enough to be there. I predate the internet, but I got gruhnguitars.com, gruhn.com, and guitars.com all for $30 each. And I checked to see if guitar.com was available, but it was already taken.
Wow. But it's always a treat. We're going to have to do this again, George, because there's never enough time to talk with you. And thank you for joining the podcast.
And if they want to reach me direct, I'm george@guitars.com.
Thank you so much,
and
George.
I read my emails, and I do respond to the ones that are from real, genuine, live people.
Awesome. Thank you, George.
Thank you.
Thanks for joining the Gear Gab Podcast with Eric Dahl. Subscribe to our weekly conversations on your favorite platform. And if you like what you hear, don't forget to leave us a review. Follow us on social media at Gear Gab Podcast. You'll never know who our next guest will be.